My parents left my 9-year-old son sitting outside my house all night because my sister needed a child-free birthday. When I confronted them, Mom said, "He survived, didn't he?" So I canceled the family vacation I'd paid for. 3 days later, my sister called screaming from the airport. At 6:14 a.m. on a Saturday in September, my neighbor Deb pounded on my front door hard enough to rattle the glass, and when I opened it, she was holding my son's hand, and he was shaking so violently his teeth were audible from 3 feet away. Miles was in his pajamas, the ones with the dinosaurs, the ones he'd had on when my parents picked him up from school the day before, and he had no shoes on, and his lips had a faint blue tint at the edges that I will see every time I close my eyes for the rest of my life. "He was sitting on your porch step," Deb said, and her voice was doing something strange, cracking around the edges of the sentence. "I saw him when I let the dog out. He said he'd been there since 8 last night. 10 hours. My son had been sitting on a concrete step in 51-degree weather for 10 hours, alone, while my parents, the 2 people I'd trusted to watch him for one evening, were 3 miles away at my sister's 30th birthday dinner, and neither of them had noticed he was gone." I called my mother from Deb's kitchen with Miles wrapped in 2 of Deb's throw blankets and a mug of hot cocoa shaking in his small hands because I couldn't trust my own hands not to shake too badly to dial. My mother answered on the 4th ring, sounding groggy, like I'd woken her from a normal Saturday morning sleep-in. "Mom," I said, "where's Miles?" There was a pause. Then, "He's not at your house? We dropped him off around 8. I thought your neighbor was watching him. We texted you. Nobody texted me anything. He was on the porch, all night, alone. He's shaking, Mom. His lips are blue." Another pause, longer this time. And then my mother said the sentence that would end up costing my family a vacation, a friendship, and possibly a proposal, though none of us knew that yet. "Well, he survived, didn't he?" I'd been a project manager at a mid-sized logistics firm for 9 years when this happened. The kind of steady, unglamorous job where you learn to read a schedule the way other people read a room. Always looking 3 moves ahead, always assuming something will slip, always building in a buffer for the truck that gets stuck at the port 2 days longer than promised. I made $86,000 a year, enough to keep Miles in the same school district after the divorce and still put something small away every month, and I was proud, in a quiet way I never said out loud, of how normal I'd managed to make his life feel despite everything changing around him. I'd been divorced from Miles's mother, Renata, for 4 years by then. An amicable enough split that we still did Thanksgiving as a rotating custody arrangement without lawyers involved, and I had primary custody the other 50 weeks of the year. Renata had relocated for a job 2 states away the year after we split, and between the distance and her demanding schedule, most of the week-to-week fell to me by default rather than by any court order. She and I talked most weeks, mostly about Miles, and she was, in the months this all unfolded, one of maybe 2 people whose judgment I trusted completely. I ran my life the same way I ran my projects. Buffers built in, backup plans for the backup plans, a spreadsheet for everything from the mortgage to Miles's dentist appointments. I never once, in 4 years of single parenthood, imagined I needed a backup plan for my own parents. My parents, Jean and Carol Hale, were both 60-something and retired. Dad from 30 years managing a regional hardware distributor, Mom from bookkeeping at the same company, which was, in its own small-town way, how they'd met. They lived 12 minutes from me in the house I grew up in, and for the first 2 years after my divorce, they were the reason I could function at all. Wednesday nights, some Saturdays, the occasional emergency pickup when a work call ran long. They were there, reliable in a way I'd stopped questioning, the way you stop questioning gravity. Miles kept a toothbrush at their house. He had a drawer of pajamas there, a shelf with his favorite dinosaur books, a stuffed triceratops named Gary that had to make the trip every single time or he wouldn't sleep. My mother knew he liked his grilled cheese cut diagonally, not straight across. Small things. The kind of things that make you trust people completely, until you have a reason not to. My sister Brooke is 8 years younger than me, 29 that September, and she moved back in with our parents 2 years earlier after a rough breakup and an even rougher stretch of underemployment. What started as a temporary arrangement quietly became permanent, and somewhere in there, without anyone announcing it, Brooke started covering a chunk of our parents' mortgage. I only learned this later from an offhand comment my father made, and became, in a way I hadn't fully clocked until it was too late, the household's center of gravity. She'd started dating a guy named Grant a year before all this, a commercial real estate broker from a family with money my family didn't have, and I remember noticing, in the months leading up to that September, how much more careful my parents had gotten around anything that made Brooke look anything less than polished in front of Grant's family. I noticed it. I just didn't think it applied to me. The first time I really felt the shift, though I didn't name it at the time, was Miles's birthday in April. My parents had promised weeks ahead to come to his party, a low-key thing, 6 kids, a rented bounce house in the backyard, and then canceled that morning because Brooke needed a ride to a work function and didn't want to deal with Ubers. My mother apologized, said they'd make it up to him, brought over a bigger present the following week. Miles seemed fine. I told myself it was fine. One missed birthday party wasn't a pattern. It was just a Tuesday-shaped inconvenience that happened to land on his birthday. There was a Sunday dinner in May that I think about more now than I did at the time. Miles and Brooke's on and off boyfriend before Grant, a guy she'd dated briefly that spring, got into it over something trivial. Who got the last dinner roll, honestly. That's genuinely what it was. And Miles, 9 years old, said something a little too loud and a little too sharp back at him. My mother didn't tell Miles to settle down. She turned to me instead, in front of everyone, and said maybe he needed a little more structure at home since it's just you now, which stung in a way I didn't examine closely at the time because I was too busy being embarrassed. Brooke's boyfriend at the time never got a word of correction for starting it. I remember driving home that night, turning the comment over and over, deciding it wasn't worth a fight, deciding my mother was just tired and said something clumsy, the way you decide most family slights aren't worth the cost of naming them out loud. The first small sign came about 6 weeks before Miles's birthday. My mother called on a Tuesday and asked if she and my father could still watch Miles that Friday like planned, but added, almost as an aside, that I shouldn't mention it to Brooke. She's stressed about some stuff with Grant's family. Mom said, easier if we just keep the schedules separate this week. I told myself that was normal. Siblings sometimes need their own space, their own version of events, especially when a new relationship is involving a whole new set of in-laws to manage. I didn't think about it again. 2 weeks later, Brooke posted a photo on Instagram from a dinner with Grant's parents, some upscale place downtown, captioned something about finally getting to just be us, and I remember scrolling past it without much thought, except that my mother had commented 3 heart emojis under it within 4 minutes, which was faster than she'd ever responded to anything I'd posted about Miles in years. I noticed the timestamp. I noticed it, and then I told myself I was being petty for noticing, and I put my phone down and went to make Miles's lunch for the next day. Evidence proving the pattern was already there. I just filed it under sibling stuff and kept moving. A week after that, my father called to ask if I could take Miles for an extra night the following weekend because he and Mom wanted to help Brooke stage her side of the house before Grant's parents came by. New throw pillows, a candle swap, moving a stack of her old boxes out of the hallway closet into their garage. I said sure, of course, and hung up thinking nothing of it, though something in the back of my mind did the quiet arithmetic. An entire Saturday spent making Brooke's space look effortless for people she'd been dating a year, versus the birthday party they'd canceled on in April. I didn't do anything with that math. I just filed it, the way you file most small unfairnesses in a family, under things that aren't worth a fight. The week before Miles's actual issue, my father mentioned, almost in passing during a Sunday phone call, that Brooke's 30th birthday dinner was going to be just adults, very low-key, Grant's parents are coming. I asked, half joking, if Miles was invited to at least stop by and say happy birthday to his aunt. My father laughed a little too quickly and said Brooke wanted it child-free this year. No offense to Miles, just something about wanting one night that felt adult and put together. My stomach did something small and uneasy at that, a tightening I couldn't name, but I told myself it was one dinner, one night, and it genuinely wasn't that deep. I let it go. My hands didn't shake. I had no idea yet what child-free was going to mean logistically. The day before the party, my mother called to firm up the plan. She and Dad would pick Miles up from school on Friday, bring him to my house since I had a late client call that ran past his bedtime, and stay with him there until I got home around 9. Simple. Routine. I'd done this dozens of times. Miles even asked me that morning, buckling into the car for school, whether Grandma and Grandpa were bringing the good popcorn, the kind with the caramel mixed in, and I told him I was sure they would be. I told her thank you, like I always did, and went to my call not thinking about it again. What actually happened that Friday, I've had to piece together in fragments, from Miles, in careful, gentle conversations over the following weeks with a therapist's guidance, and from what my parents eventually admitted, reluctantly, under pressure they clearly hadn't expected to face. My parents picked Miles up at 3:15, brought him to my house, made him a grilled cheese, and let him watch cartoons. Around 6:30, my mother got a text from Brooke. Grant's parents had arrived early. Could they come by for just a few minutes before dinner to say hi? My parents decided between the two of them, apparently without much discussion, that a few minutes wouldn't hurt, and that Miles, watching television, entertained, safe in his own house, would be fine alone for the short drive over. They told him they'd be right back. He said okay. He was 9. He believed them. A few minutes became the full dinner. My father would later tell me they'd meant to swing back after the appetizer course, but Brooke had pulled my mother aside almost immediately to talk about something. My father was vague about what, at the time, in a way I now understand, was deliberate, and one course became 4, and by the time anyone thought to check the clock again, it was after 10, and my parents had both had 2 glasses of wine each and decided, jointly, that Miles was probably asleep by now anyway, and it would be easier to just head home themselves and check on him first thing in the morning. Miles was not asleep. Miles had woken up around 8, alone in a dark house, and done exactly what a scared 9-year-old does. He panicked, tried calling my cell twice from the house phone. I'd left it on silent during my client call and didn't check it again until nearly 10, a decision I will regret for the rest of my life. And then, terrified that someone might be trying to get in and unsure what else to do, let himself out the front door to sit on the porch step where he could see the street, where he told his therapist later he felt like he could at least run if something happened. He sat there in 51-degree weather, in dinosaur pajamas, from roughly 8 o'clock until Deb found him at 6:14 the next morning. The porch light had a timer on it that switched off at midnight, so for the last 6 hours of that night he'd been sitting in the dark, counting streetlights, listening to a sprinkler system 2 yards over cycle on and off at 4 a.m., the way it did every night, a sound he now flinches at whenever we drive past that house. My parents had gone home, gone to bed, and slept through the entire night without once driving the 3 miles back to check. doctor. Anita Fenwick, the pediatrician at the urgent care clinic I took Miles to that same morning, had been practicing for 15 years and had seen, she told me carefully, plenty of cold exposure cases in children, though rarely one where the child had been alone outdoors overnight in a residential neighborhood with two capable adults 12 minutes away. She checked his core temperature, which had come back up to 97. One, by the time we saw her, still on the low end but no longer dangerous, and documented mild hypothermia symptoms in her chart, the shaking, the lip discoloration, a slightly elevated heart rate that had mostly settled by the time we arrived. She sat on the little rolling stool across from him and asked him gently if he could tell her what he remembered, and I watched my 9-year-old describe, in a flat, careful voice that broke my heart more than crying would have, how he'd counted the streetlights turning on one by one to keep himself calm. She was the one who explained to me, gently, that this kind of case, a minor left unsupervised overnight, regardless of intent, was something she was required to report. "It's not about blaming anyone in this room," she told me, writing quickly on her intake form. "It's mandatory reporting law. Any medical provider who becomes aware of a child left without adequate supervision overnight has to notify the county. It protects Miles. It also protects your family, honestly, because it puts an official record in place instead of leaving this as a story people can argue about later." The call came from Child Protective Services 2 days later. A caseworker named Dolores Byrne, 12 years with the county, soft-voiced but exact in her questions, came to my house to interview Miles alone first and then me, walking through the timeline with a patience that made me want to scream, even though I understood exactly why she needed it. She asked Miles what he remembered about the front door, whether it locked automatically behind him, whether he knew how to get back inside, whether anyone had ever talked to him about what to do if he felt scared and alone in the house. She asked me, separately, whether this was the first time my parents had left him without checking in, and I found myself, humiliatingly, having to think back through 6 weeks of small red flags to answer honestly. She confirmed what Dr. Fenwick's chart already said: no signs of ongoing abuse or neglect in my own household. This was categorized as a single incident involving alternate caregivers rather than the custodial parent. But she was direct about one thing. "I'd strongly recommend," she told me, closing her folder, "that any future childcare involving your parents be supervised, at least until there's some clarity about what happened and why. I'm not telling you to cut them off. I'm telling you that we thought he'd be fine isn't a plan, and a 9-year-old needs an actual plan." Dolores came back once more, 3 weeks later, for what she called a case closure visit. Standard practice, she explained, for incidents that don't rise to formal removal proceedings, but still need a documented resolution before the file is marked complete. She sat at my kitchen table with a laptop and asked me to walk her through what safeguards I'd put in place since the initial report, the supervision agreement Farah Kessler had helped me draft, the therapist Miles had started seeing, the fact that my parents hadn't had him alone, even for 20 minutes, since that morning. She typed as I talked, and at the end she turned the laptop toward me so I could see the closing summary before she filed it. "Family has implemented appropriate protective measures. Case closed. No further action recommended at this time." And something about seeing that sentence in an official document, rather than just hearing it from my own exhausted brain, made me exhale for what felt like the first time in 3 weeks. Miles's school got involved that same week, on their own, without me asking. His 4th grade teacher flagged that he'd fallen asleep at his desk twice, and seemed unusually jumpy at loud noises, and the school counselor, a woman named Renee Okoro, who'd been doing elementary counseling for 11 years, called me to ask, carefully, whether anything had changed at home. When I told her what happened, she didn't seem shocked so much as recalibrated, the way professionals do when a puzzle piece finally clicks into place. She offered to keep an eye on him during the day and let his teacher know he might need extra patience for a while, and she gave me the name of a child trauma therapist she trusted, which is how Miles ended up 3 weeks later, sitting on a beanbag chair twice a week talking through what a porch step at 8 o'clock at night had felt like. That same week, an Ashcombe County patrol officer named Desmond Ruiz, 9 years on the force, filed the initial welfare check report from the morning Deb hauled it in, a report I later requested a copy of through the department's records office, mostly because I needed to see, in someone else's flat official language, that this had actually happened the way I remembered it, and wasn't some exaggerated version my own grief and rage had built. Officer Ruiz had been the one to actually respond to Deb's 911 call before I'd even gotten there, and he told me, when I called the non-emergency line to follow up, that he'd noted Miles's temperature complaints and the duration of exposure in his report specifically because both fell into a range the department flags for referral, rather than just documenting and closing. The report used the phrase unattended minor extended overnight exposure in the incident classification field. Reading those 5 words on official letterhead did something to me that no conversation with my mother had managed to do. It made it real in a way feelings alone hadn't. I met with a family law attorney, Farah Kessler, the following week. Not to sue anyone, I told her right away, just to understand my options, and she listened to the whole timeline without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad in handwriting I couldn't read upside down. She told me that because my parents weren't legal guardians and had no standing custody order, there was nothing to formally litigate unless I wanted to pursue something more drastic than I felt was warranted. What she recommended instead was simpler and, in its own way, more useful. A written agreement, not legally binding but clearly documented, that any future childcare would need to be supervised or pre-approved in writing. No exceptions. No, just a few minutes. She helped me draft it in plain language, 2 paragraphs, nothing dramatic, and told me to send it certified mail so there'd be a delivery record. My parents received it the way you'd expect people to receive a letter from their son's lawyer. Not well. The vacation itself I didn't think about again for almost a week. I had a 9-year-old in therapy, a formal CPS file, and a relationship with my parents that felt like it was actively rotting in real time, until I opened the family trip planning email folder one night, mostly out of habit, to check on a deposit deadline I'd half remembered. I'd booked it back in the spring. An 11-person Cabo Villa for the whole family. Me, Miles, my parents, Brooke, and once she'd asked to add them a few weeks in, Grant and his parents and his younger brother. Group reservation number VLL58214. Booked under my card because I was the one with the airline miles and the Villa company's loyalty discount, with a $4,800 non-refundable deposit split, in theory, across everyone once we settled up later. I'd been the one filling out the group form, the one fielding the company's emails, the one who'd agreed, without reading the fine print closely enough, to a clause that voided the shared unit discount for every traveler on the reservation if the primary holder withdrew. I sat there at 11 at night, my son finally asleep down the hall for the first full night since the incident, and read through 6 weeks of email threads I'd mostly skimmed at the time. And that's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop the way it hadn't dropped since Deb's face in my doorway. Grant's parents' names, Preston and Diane Ashford, hadn't just been added to the guest list. They'd been added to the exact same shared unit block as Brooke and Grant 3 weeks before the party, the same week my mother had started telling me to keep things separate from Brooke's schedule. I called the Villa company's booking line the next morning, my coffee going cold on the desk beside my laptop while I sat on hold for 11 minutes, listening to a looped acoustic guitar track. A customer relations manager named Sandra Whitlock, 8 years with the company, pulled up the reservation and walked me through it once I explained I was the primary card holder, trying to confirm the guest manifest before a family decision. You've got 11 travelers listed across 3 connecting units, she said, keys clicking as she scrolled. Looks like there were 2 modification requests back in August, the 6th and the 19th, both made by a Brooke Hale, listed as an authorized contact on the file. The first moved 2 guests, a Preston and Diane Ashford, into the unit connecting to the primary suite. The second one's more of a note than a change. She asked whether the rooftop terrace on Unit 2 could be held privately for a couple hours on the evening of the 14th. Just family, is what it says here. We flagged it as a special request line, since the terrace isn't typically reservable exclusively, but our concierge team followed up and confirmed it could be arranged. I asked her, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, whether Brooke had needed my authorization for either of those changes, given that I was the one whose card was on file and whose name the group discount was built around. Sandra was quiet for a second. Technically, any listed authorized contact can request modifications to guest configuration, she said. It's not something we'd have flagged as unusual, since she was already on the reservation as a traveler. I'm sorry, is there a problem with the booking? I told her not yet. I didn't understand yet what that terrace note meant. I would, in about 10 days. I had until the cancellation deadline, 48 hours out from that call, to decide whether to walk away from a trip I'd already paid a $4,800 deposit on, knowing that if I withdrew as primary holder, the whole group's discount collapsed, and the booking, all 11 seats of it, unraveled with me. I want to be honest about what those 48 hours actually felt like, because it wasn't the clean, righteous decision it probably looks like from the outside. I barely slept either of those 2 nights, which after the week I'd already had felt less like insomnia and more like my body simply refusing to shut off. My hands wouldn't stop shaking every time I opened the reservation portal. That same shake I'd felt standing in Deb's kitchen watching Miles hold a mug of cocoa he couldn't quite keep steady. I kept thinking about my cousins, my aunt, people who'd done nothing wrong and had nothing to do with what happened to Miles. All of them about to have their trip yanked out from under them because of a decision I hadn't made yet. Twice I opened the portal and closed the laptop again without touching anything, telling myself I needed more time, more information, a cleaner reason than fury. I also thought, more than I wanted to admit, about what canceling would look like from the outside. The version of this where I'm just a bitter older brother punishing his little sister's happiness because his own life felt smaller by comparison. I ran the numbers 3 separate times. Like the math itself might tell me something the feelings couldn't. $4,800 gone, 11 people's plans gone, a family reputation I'd spent 37 years building as the reasonable one, the reliable one, potentially gone too. Weighed against 10 hours on a concrete step in 51-degree weather. Weighed against 5 words from my own mother. I kept doing the math anyway, over and over, like repetition might change the answer, even after I already knew what the answer was. I called Renata at one point, at nearly midnight on the second night, just to talk it through, sitting on my back steps in the cold, because I didn't want to wake Miles pacing around the kitchen. I read her the clause about the shared discount out loud, twice, like maybe hearing it again would change what it said. She was quiet for a while on the other end. Then she said the thing that finally settled it for me. You're not punishing the trip, Jordan. You're just refusing to keep paying for the version of this family that left our son on a porch step and called it survival. If your parents wanted everyone to keep their vacation, they had 11 weeks to tell the truth about what happened before before you found out from a lawyer's report and a 5-word line on a police form. That's not on you. That was always going to cost something. You just get to decide whether it costs you your dignity too, or just $4,800. I sat out there until my fingers went numb, watching my breath fog under the porch light in a strange, unintentional echo of miles 2 weeks earlier that I didn't let myself think about too hard. Then I went inside, opened the portal one more time, and this time I didn't close the laptop. I withdrew from the reservation at 9:02 the next morning, 41 minutes before the deadline, my finger hovering over the confirmation button for a long, cold minute before I pressed it. Gone. The whole thing, gone, in the time it took a webpage to reload. I told Miles that afternoon, sitting across from him at the kitchen table while he ate a bowl of cereal well past the hour cereal is supposed to be eaten, because some rules had gotten looser in the 2 weeks since the porch step, and I hadn't found the energy to tighten them back up yet. I kept it simple. We weren't going to Cabo anymore, I told him, because of what happened with Grandma and Grandpa, and because I didn't think it was right to keep doing normal fun things with people who hadn't yet said they understood what they'd done wrong. He was quiet for a second, spoon halfway to his mouth, and then he asked if that meant he wouldn't get to go swimming with Gary the Triceratops, since he'd been planning, with total 9-year-old sincerity, to take the stuffed animal into the villa pool. We'll go swimming somewhere else, I told him. Just not there. Not this time. He nodded slowly, the way kids do when they're deciding whether a thing is actually a big deal or not, and then he said, "Is Aunt Brooke going to be mad at you?" I told him probably yes, for a while. He thought about that too, chewing, and then said, "That's okay. She was kind of mad about me before anyway." I didn't have a response for that one that didn't make my throat tight, so I just told him to finish his cereal, and I went and stood at the sink for a minute with the water running so he wouldn't see my face. The family group chat exploded within the hour. My aunt wanted to know why I'd ruined Thanksgiving in September, which didn't quite make sense chronologically, but conveyed the general temperature well enough. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in a year sent 3 separate messages demanding I grow up and stop making everything about Miles, followed by a 4th message, sent to the whole thread, wondering aloud whether I'd always been kind of a control freak, now that he thought about it. My uncle, who'd booked flights already, wanted to know if he could at least get reimbursed for the airfare, as if I were personally running the airline. Nobody in that chat, I realized reading through it with my stomach in knots, actually knew why I'd canceled. My parents hadn't told anyone. As far as most of the family understood, I'd simply thrown a tantrum and blown up an 11-person vacation over nothing. The same way I imagine some of them had decided years ago that I was the sibling who took things too personally, and Brooke was the one who just wanted everyone to have a good time. I didn't correct them right away. I told myself I was being the bigger person, letting the silence speak for itself. Mostly, if I'm honest, I just didn't have the energy that week to relive the porch step story one more time for an audience that had already decided I was the villain. I set the group chat to muted on day 2 and didn't open it again for 4 days, which in hindsight was its own kind of mistake, because it meant the only version of events circulating through my extended family for those 4 days was the one my parents and Brooke had quietly let stand. It was my cousin Whitaker, the same cousin who'd been messaging me about growing up, who let something slip 4 days later, not realizing what he was actually revealing. He'd texted me directly this time, not in the group chat, something almost conciliatory in tone, trying to find a middle ground he assumed existed. "Even if you had a point about Miles," he wrote, "you didn't have to torch the whole Cabo thing. Brooke had that whole rooftop moment planned with Grant. You know he was going to propose up there, right? His mom told my mom weeks ago. Sandra at the villa company even blocked off the terrace for them. It's in some group message Brooke sent out back in August that got forwarded around. I read that message 3 times before it landed. Brooke hadn't just added Grant's family to my reservation as a courtesy. She'd built an entire proposal around a trip she didn't own, funded by a deposit I'd paid, using a discount that existed because of my name on the account, and she'd apparently never once considered mentioning any of it to me. Not out of forgetfulness, but because the whole plan depended on looking effortless, unburdened, exactly the kind of woman who didn't come with complications like a nephew who needed supervision. My hands went cold reading it. Everything. The child-free comment, the keep things separate instructions, the staged pillows, the careful curation in front of Grant's parents, clicked into a shape I hadn't let myself see until that exact moment. She hadn't just failed to defend Miles that morning, she'd needed him invisible for months before that morning ever happened. 3 days after I withdrew from the reservation, Brooke called me screaming from the airport. I picked up expecting another round of the group chat outrage, braced for it the way you brace for a familiar kind of weather. Instead, her voice came through ragged, panicked, barely words at first. "The villa's gone," she said. "They just told us at check-in there's no reservation under our name. They said the whole group booking got voided. What did you do, Jordan? What did you actually do?" "I withdrew," I said, exactly like the contract said I could. "You knew what this trip meant to me. You knew, and you did this anyway in front of Grant's parents. At the airport. Are you serious right now?" I could hear it behind her. An airport gate, boarding announcements, and underneath it, a man's voice, calm, asking her what was going on, and a woman's voice after that, older, careful, asking the same question. Grant's parents, standing right there. I didn't yell. I'd promised myself, somewhere in those 48 hours before I hit cancel, that whatever happened next, I wasn't going to be the one who made a scene. So I told her, flatly, evenly, loud enough that I knew whoever was standing standing near her, could hear every word through the phone's speaker because she hadn't thought to put it to her ear. I canceled the villa because I was the primary holder on an 11-person reservation, and I wasn't going to keep funding a trip for a family that left my 9-year-old alone on a porch step for 10 hours in 51-degree weather so you could have a child-free birthday dinner. Mom's exact words when I called her that morning were, "Well, he survived, didn't he? I have a CPS caseworker's report and a pediatrician's chart that say it's a little more complicated than that." Silence. Real silence, the kind that has weight to it, the kind you can hear other people not breathing into. Then Diane Ashford's voice, close to the phone now, careful and cold in a way that told me she'd already stopped thinking about a proposal and started thinking about something else entirely. "Brooke," she said, "is that true? I don't know exactly what happened at that gate after Brooke hung up on me because I wasn't there, and the version I have is secondhand, filtered through Whitaker again, who'd apparently been looped in by Grant's brother in a separate chat. What I do know is that the proposal didn't happen that week. Grant's family flew home 3 days early on their own dime without Brooke and boarded their return flight barely speaking to her, according to the little Whitaker managed to piece together from his own cousin on Grant's side. 6 months out, things are not fixed exactly, and I've stopped expecting them to be in the clean way people want a story like this to end. My parents watch Miles now, but only with me or Renata in the house, and my mother still, occasionally, brings up the vacation like it's the injury instead of the 10 hours on the porch step that caused it. Brooke and I haven't really spoken since the airport. She sent one message in November, 3 lines long, that said she was sorry things had gotten so out of hand, which is not, I've noticed, the same as sorry for what actually happened, and I haven't found the version of myself yet that's ready to pretend it is. Grant and Brooke didn't break up right away, which I think surprised both of us. He gave it another 2 months, according to Whitaker, who has apparently appointed himself the family's unofficial correspondent in all of this. But something about that gate, about his own mother's voice asking, "Is that true?" in front of a boarding line full of strangers, seems to have followed him home in a way Brooke couldn't talk her way back out of. They split the following spring. His parents, from what I understand, never did come around on the idea of her. Not fully, not after Cabo. I don't know all the reasons, and it isn't entirely my business, but I'd be lying if I said the airport didn't come up in more than one account I heard about it afterward. My parents did not handle any of this gracefully. My mother called me twice that first week, first defensive, accusing me of airing family business to strangers, as if the strangers in question hadn't been standing next to my sister for the entire meltdown. And then, 3 days later, something closer to frightened. Brooke, it turned out, had told them flatly that if they didn't find a way to make this right with Grant's family, she was done covering half their mortgage. My father, who I'd never once in my life heard sound uncertain about anything, called me and asked, in a voice I didn't recognize, what he was supposed to do now. It was the first time in my life my father had ever asked me for advice about anything that mattered, and I sat there on the phone for a second, almost enjoying it before I hated myself for enjoying it. I told him the same thing Farrah Kessler had put in that letter weeks earlier: supervised time with Miles, in writing, no exceptions, no more, just a few minutes. I told him I wasn't interested in punishing anyone further, but I also wasn't interested in pretending the porch step hadn't happened just because it was now inconvenient for everyone's finances too. My Aunt Yvonne, the one who'd complained the loudest in the group chat about a ruined Thanksgiving in September, called me privately about 2 weeks after the airport, once Whitaker's version of events had made its way fully around the family. She didn't apologize exactly, that's not really how my family does things, but she asked quietly whether Miles was doing okay, and then she told me something I hadn't known, that she'd sat next to my mother at church the Sunday after the funeral of a family friend years back, and heard her say almost proudly that Brooke had always been the one who needed more looking after. I don't know what to do with that memory, except that it made something in the last 20 years click a half-inch further into place. Deb still lives 3 doors down, and I've never quite figured out how to thank her properly for a Saturday morning that changed the shape of my whole family, so mostly I just wave a little too enthusiastically whenever I see her out with the dog. And last month I finally worked up the nerve to bring her a bottle of wine and try to say something real about it. She waved it off, said anyone would have done the same, though I don't fully believe that, and then she asked quietly how Miles was doing now, in a voice that told me she still thought about that morning too. Miles is doing better. Dr. Fenwick cleared him medically within a month. The therapist says the nightmares have mostly stopped, though he still, some nights, asks me to check that the front door is locked twice instead of once, and I do it without complaint every single time, because I understand exactly what that second check is buying him. Last week he asked me, out of nowhere while we were doing dishes, whether Grandma and Grandpa still loved him even though they'd left. I told him yes, and that grown-ups can love someone and still get it badly wrong, and that both things had turned out to be true here. He thought about that for a second, the way 9-year-olds do when you hand them something a little too big, and then asked if we could still have popcorn with caramel mixed in on Friday, just the 2 of us, and I said we absolutely could. My mother asked me once, months later on the phone, in a voice that wanted absolution more than it wanted honesty, whether I thought the trip had really been worth canceling over, whether Miles being fine now in the end meant she hadn't been all that wrong to say what she'd said that morning. He survived, didn't he? I told her the truth. He survived. The vacation didn't. The proposal didn't. And some days I still can't tell whether she understands that those were never 3 separate casualties, just one decision playing out through 3 times in 3 different rooms she wasn't standing in.